The 9,941st meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is threats to international peace and security. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Iraq, the Islamic Republic of Iran, Israel, and Kuwait to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Mr. Miroslav Janša, Assistant Secretary General for Europe, Central Asia and Americas, Departments of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs and Peace Operations, and Mr. Rafael Mariano Grossi, Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. I wish to warmly welcome the Secretary General, His Excellency Mr. Antonio Guterres, and give him the floor.
Madam President, with your permission, I will make a small introduction, and then my two colleagues will brief the Council. Excellencies, 2 days ago, in this very chamber, I made a direct appeal: give peace a chance. That call was not heeded. Instead, the bombing of Iranian nuclear facilities by the United States marks a perilous turn in a region that is already reeling. From the outset of the crisis, I have repeatedly condemned any military escalation in the Middle East. The people of the region cannot endure another cycle of destruction. And yet, we now risk descending into a rathole of retaliation after retaliation. To avoid it, diplomacy must prevail. Civilians must be protected. Safe maritime navigation must be guaranteed. We must act immediately and decisively to halt the fighting and return to serious, sustained negotiations on the Iran nuclear program. We need a credible, comprehensive, and verifiable solution, one that restores trust, including with full access to inspectors of the IAEA as the United Nations technical authority in this field. The Non-Proliferation Treaty is a cornerstone of international peace and security. Iran must fully respect it. And all member states must act in accordance with their obligations under the UN Charter and other rules of international law, including international humanitarian law. The United Nations stands ready to support any and all efforts toward a peaceful resolution. But peace cannot be imposed. It must be chosen. Madam President, we face a stark choice. One path leads to wider war, deeper human suffering, and serious damage to the international order. The other leads to de-escalation, diplomacy, and dialogue. We know which path is right, and I urge this Council and all Member States to act with reason, restraint, and urgency. We cannot and must not give up on peace. Thank you.
I thank the Secretary General for his remarks, and I now give the floor to Ms. Miroslav Janša.
Madam President, on the evening of 21 June, the President of the United States announced that the US military conducted strikes against the Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan nuclear facilities in Iran. Shortly thereafter, the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran confirmed that the attacks around the nuclear sites had taken place. Iranian state media indicated the 3 sites had been evacuated and the highly enriched uranium stockpile transferred in advance. Iran has said there were no immediate signs of radioactive contamination at the 3 locations following the strikes. The Crisis Management Bureau of COM, where Fordow is located, stated that the perimeter of the Fordow nuclear site had been targeted. Iranian state media said only 2 tunnels for entry and exit were destroyed at Fordow. Preliminary open-source satellite imagery shows damage at various points at the facility. I urge Iran to allow IAEA inspectors access to the sites to conduct damage assessments as soon as safety conditions allow. I also note that this Council will shortly hear from IAEA Director General Grossi. The latest development must be viewed with the utmost seriousness. It marks a dangerous escalation in a conflict that has already devastated many lives in both countries, in a region on the edge. It is a direct threat to international peace and security. Madam President, Under-Secretary General Di Carlo told this Council only 2 days ago that we were teetering on the edge of a full-blown conflict. I fear we are now in that dangerous moment. Meanwhile, the hostilities between Israel and Iran continue and are now in their 10th day. Hours after the US strikes, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, said it had launched some 40 missiles at Israel. Israeli authorities reported that more than 85 people were injured in the barrage, and numerous structures in Tel Aviv and its southern suburbs sustained heavy damage, including many residential buildings and an elder care home. Israel also said it had launched a series of strikes against military targets in Iran, including in Tehran, Tabriz, and Yazd. The Israel Defense Forces, IDF, said 30 fighter jets had struck dozens of military targets across Iran. Iranian media reported several civilian fatalities, including children, and damage to homes and other civilian infrastructure. Earlier, on 21st June, Israel attacked for a second time since 13 June the Isfahan nuclear complex, hitting 6 buildings. According to Iran's Ministry of Health, as of 21st June, 430 people have been killed and more than 3,500 others injured due to Israeli strikes across Iran. Most have been civilians. According to Israeli authorities, 25 Israelis have been killed and 1,300 more have been injured since the beginning of exchanges with Iran. Madam President, the conflict risks engulfing the region in further instability and volatility. Some non-state armed groups aligned with Iran warned against US involvement. The Houthis in Yemen and some armed groups in Iraq vowed to attack if the US intervened in the conflict between Israel and Iran. Iran's parliament unanimously expressed support for measures to close the Strait of Hormuz, a vital maritime route for global energy transit. Iran's Supreme National Security Council would need to take the final decision. I recall the rights and obligations of all states under international law in relation to maritime navigation. Madam President, the Middle East cannot afford yet another violent conflict where civilians pay the price of military confrontations. And the world will also not be spared from the ramifications of this dangerous conflict. I echo the Secretary General's call on member states and on the members of the Security Council to de-escalate and to uphold their obligations under the UN Charter, notably the obligation to settle their international disputes by peaceful means and other rules of international law. All states must live up to their nuclear commitments. All parties to the conflict must also comply with the relevant rules of international humanitarian law in the conduct of their military operations. There is no military solution to this conflict. We need diplomacy, de-escalation, and confidence building now. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank Mr. Yencha for his briefing, and I now give the floor to Mr. Rafael Mariano Grossi.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I would like to thank the Secretary General for his permanent support to the IAEA and myself in the discharge of my duties. I also like to thank the Assistant Secretary General for his intervention right now. I have convened a special session of the Board of Governors of the IAEA tomorrow morning in Vienna to continue the consideration of this issue that this body has started today, or has continued today, rather. Secretary General, Madam President, dear permanent representatives, colleagues, the nuclear non-proliferation regime that has underpinned international security for more than half a century is on the line. The dramatic events in Iran have become even more serious with last night's bombardments and the potential widening of the conflict. We have a window of opportunity to return to dialogue and diplomacy. If that window closes, violence and destruction could reach unthinkable levels, and the global non-proliferation regime, as we know it, could crumble and fall. Iran, Israel, Iran, the Middle East need peace, and there is a path for diplomacy. We must return, as the Secretary General just said, to the negotiating table and allow the IAEA inspectors, the guardians of the NPT, to go back to Iran's nuclear sites and account for the stockpiles of uranium, including, most importantly, the 400 kilograms of enriched uranium at 60%. Any agreement, ladies and gentlemen, any arrangement will have as a prerequisite the establishment of the facts on the ground. This can be done only through IAEA inspections. IAEA inspectors are in Iran, and they must do their job. This will require a cessation of hostilities so that Iran can let the teams into the sites under the necessary safety and security conditions. Any special measures by Iran to protect its nuclear materials and equipment can be done in accordance with Iran's safeguards obligations with the agency. This is possible. Madam President, based on the information available to the IAEA, let me update you on what has occurred at Iran's nuclear sites since I last addressed this Council 3 days ago. Craters are visible at the Fordo site, Iran's main location for enriching uranium at 60%, indicating the use by the United States of America of ground-penetrating munitions. This is consistent with statements from the United States. At this time, no one, including the IAEA, is in a position to assess the underground damage at Fordo. At the Isfahan nuclear site, additional buildings were hit overnight, with the US confirming their use of cruise missiles. Affected buildings include some related to uranium conversion process. Also, at this site, entrances to tunnels used for the storage of enriched material appear to have been hit. At the Natanz enrichment site, the fuel enrichment plant has been hit again, with the US confirming that it used ground-penetrating munitions. Iran has informed the IAEA there has been no increase in off-site radiation levels at the 3 sites. The situation at all other sites in Iran remains as I described them to you 3 days ago. We continue to monitor the situation and encourage the Iranian regulator to maintain its indispensable contact with the IAEA's Incident and Emergency Center. Madam President, the IAEA has consistently underlined, as stated in General Conference resolutions, that armed attacks on nuclear facilities should never take place and could result in radioactive releases with grave consequences within and beyond the boundaries of the state, which has been attacked. I therefore again call on maximum restraint. Military escalation threatens lives and delays a diplomatic solution for the long-term assurance that Iran does not acquire a nuclear weapon. It also threatens the global non-proliferation regime. As I stated 3 days ago and before, I am ready to travel immediately and to engage with all relevant parties to help ensure the protection of nuclear facilities and the continued peaceful uses of nuclear technology in accordance with the agency's mandate. With your support, the IAEA can deploy nuclear safety and security experts to Iran immediately, in addition to our safeguards inspectors, wherever they are needed. Madam President, there is arguably no more important and universally supported endeavor than ensuring that we use the enormous power of the atom for good rather than destruction. Let us not allow the window to close on diplomacy. Let us not allow the non-proliferation regime to fail. Irrespective of individual positions and views, one thing is certain, and this is the simple truth: we will not be safer if there are more nuclear weapons in more states around the world. The IAEA is ready to do its part to bring this military confrontation to an end. Thank you very much.
I thank Mr. Grossi for his briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who may wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam President. At the outset, I'd like to express my appreciation to Guyana, Presidency of the Security Council, for promptly convening today's meeting at this increasingly precarious moment. I thank the Secretary General for his powerful statement. I also appreciate IAEA Director General Grossi and ASG Yancha for their informative briefings. In just over a week, this Council has met 3 times. Yet, regrettably, each session has witnessed a further escalation of tensions. The Republic of Korea reiterates its profound concern over the deteriorating situation in the Middle East and expresses its sincere hope for urgent de-escalation. When we gathered last Friday, we voiced our hope that a renewed opening for diplomacy might emerge. It is lamentable that in a matter of only 2 days, that hope now seems even more distant than before. Despite the deeply concerning developments in recent days, the Republic of Korea remains firmly convinced that no sustainable resolution to this crisis can be achieved through military means alone. Indeed, now more than ever, we implore all parties to recognize that diplomacy is not merely an option, but an urgent necessity. We call on all sides to exercise maximum restraint and to commit in earnest to restoring dialogue and engaging in reinvigorated diplomatic efforts. Madam President, at this perilous moment, it is vital to prevent a further downward spiral. We therefore reiterate our call for full respect for the UN Charter and international law, and the safeguarding of the international non-proliferation regime. Any indiscriminate attacks against civilians or civilian objects are prohibited. This is an absolute principle that must be upheld, especially as the situation grows ever more volatile. The Republic of Korea highly appreciates the IAEA for its unwavering efforts to ensure nuclear safety and security under these extremely challenging circumstances. We also remain mindful of the safeguards implications of the current crisis. All parties need to return to the table so both military actions and nuclear safeguards concerns can come to an end. In conclusion, Madam President, it is imperative to avoid any further military escalation and prevent a spread of the conflict. We strongly hope that a renewed window for diplomacy will open again. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I thank you for convening this emergency meeting of the Security Council. The gravity of the situation in the Middle East demands the Council's immediate attention as it discharges its primary responsibility to maintain international peace and security. I thank His Excellency Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, for his introductory statement. And I also thank Assistant Secretary General Miroslav Janka and Director General Rafael Grossi of the IAEA for their timely and important briefings. Sierra Leone aligns with the Secretary General's call for immediate de-escalation to avert, and I quote, catastrophic consequences for civilians, the region, and the world, end of quote. While guided by our earlier interventions at meetings held on the 13th and 20th June on this situation, the alarming developments compel this Council to act with urgency. We are concerned to note that less than 24 hours ago, the United States of America struck nuclear facilities at Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan in the Islamic Republic of Iran. Earlier that day, the State of Israel launched further strikes on the Isfahan complex. Iran also responded with missile launches at Israel. We take note of Director General Grossi's briefing on the off-site radiation in the nuclear facilities hit by the strikes. The event, however, heightened the risk of radiological disaster and increased civilian suffering. Sierra Leone is deeply concerned by these military strikes, particularly as they target nuclear installations and densely populated areas in Iran and Israel. Even as we recognize the complexities of the regional security environment, these developments call for renewed commitment to the principles of the UN Charter and international law. The use of force is among the most serious matters before this Council. Article 2.4 of the Charter obliges all member states to refrain, and I quote, from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, end of quote. In this instance, we note with concern that the strikes were conducted without Council authorization, nor was there a clear invocation of the right of self-defense under Article 51 in response to or an imminent armed attack. As we approach the 80th anniversary of the Charter, born of a collective resolve to, and I quote, save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, end of quote, we are witnessing actions that undermine its promise. These attacks starkly contrast the spirit of collective security envisioned in San Francisco. We underscore that collective security remains the bedrock of the rules-based international order and calls for strict and consistent adherence to the UN Charter. Madam President, the targeting of nuclear facilities heighten our concerns. International humanitarian law requires particular caution regarding such sites due to the potential for grave humanitarian and environmental harm. The IAEA has repeatedly affirmed that attacks or threats against nuclear facilities devoted to peaceful purposes violates the Charter, the IAEA statute, and international law. We therefore stress the critical importance of upholding the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the cornerstone of the global non-proliferation and disarmament architecture. The NPT prevents nuclear weapons proliferation and provides a framework for addressing concerns related to peaceful nuclear energy. Actions outside this framework risk undermining the treaty's authority and effectiveness. We urge all parties to utilize the NPT mechanisms, including through the IAEA, to address legitimate concerns and avoid measures that weaken this vital instrument of international peace and security. Madam President, we have taken note of Iran's recent letter of 21st June 2025, Israel's communication citing self-defense, and a joint letter from France, Germany, and the United Kingdom. These underline the mounting claims and counterclaims, reinforcing this Council's duty to uphold the Charter. In this regard, Sierra Leone therefore advances the following point. First, we call for an immediate comprehensive ceasefire. Continued hostilities risk igniting a wider regional conflict, destabilizing maritime routes, and uncertain fragile energy markets. There is no military solution. We urge all parties to engage in diplomatic talks and resume structured dialogue towards restoring Resolution 2231 and a joint comprehensive plan of action before remaining measures expire on 18th June 2025. The potential broader consequences of an escalating conflict must not be overlooked. Disruption of key shipping lanes could severely affect small and developing economies, particularly those still recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic and grappling with debt distress. Such disruptions risk inflaming our human and common insecurities, economic distress, disaffection among youth, irregular migration, and fragile social cohesion far beyond the region. Second, we demand strict protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure. We have already been briefed by ASG Yencha on the civilian casualties in Iran as well as in Israel since 13th June. Hospitals, power stations, and homes have suffered damage. We call for safe corridors for medical evacuation and humanitarian relief in line with international law. Third, we emphasize that the NPT remains central to global security. We urge Iran to continue full cooperation with the IAEA and resolve outstanding safeguard issues. We equally urge restraint by all states to protect the integrity of the NPT. Fourth and lastly, we support full IAEA verification, transparent use of the procurement channel, and provisional application of the additional protocol as confidence-building measures essential to regional stability. In closing, Madam President, we must recall that immense power brings immense responsibility. States, including those entrusted with great power by the UN Charter, have a duty to act in ways that uphold peace, security, and a rules-based order. Setting aside the Charter's principle risk weakening the safeguards that protect us all and may embolden unilateral actions elsewhere. At this difficult moment, Sierra Leone appeals for de-escalation, restraint, and the pursuit of diplomacy. Let us remember that behind geopolitical decisions are the lives of ordinary people, men, women, and children, who look to this Council to safeguard their peace, security, and dignity. We hope that our actions will honor that trust and the promise of San Francisco. I thank you.
The representative of Sierra Leone for his statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President, and thank you for convening this meeting. I'd like to start by thanking the Secretary General, ASG Yanka, and DG Grossi for briefing us today. This is a pivotal moment for the region. A further spiral of conflict poses serious risks to regional and international peace and stability. Our foremost priority must now be to support de-escalation. We have long made clear that Iran must not have a nuclear weapon and that their nuclear program represents a serious threat to international peace and security. The United States took action last night to alleviate that threat. The United Kingdom did not participate in US or Israeli strikes. But military action alone cannot bring a durable solution to concerns about Iran's nuclear program. My Prime Minister has been clear. We urge Iran now to show restraint, and we urge all parties to return to the negotiating table and find a diplomatic solution which stops further escalation and brings this crisis to an end. It is in the interests of all parties to pursue such a deal. This was the joint call made by my Prime Minister with his French and German counterparts earlier today. Together with our E3 partners, the UK has long pursued a diplomatic solution to address Iran's nuclear escalation. On Friday, alongside E3 and EU colleagues, my Foreign Secretary met Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi in Geneva to press directly for a return to diplomacy. My Foreign Minister spoke to Foreign Minister Araghchi again today and stressed the urgency of this, and we continue to engage partners across the region. President, the UK reiterates its full support for the IAEA and Director General Grossi for their critical work, professionalism, and impartiality. The IAEA and the Non-Proliferation Treaty are key pillars of international security. Threats against IAEA staff and the DG are unacceptable. We urge Iran to cooperate fully with the IAEA. Failure to do so will only further fuel escalation. President, now is the time for de-escalation and a return to diplomacy. It is essential Iran chooses this path. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam President.
Je remercie
Madam
tout d'abord
President,
Monsieur
I
le
first of
Secrétaire
all wish to
Général
thank
des
the
Nations
Secretary
Unies
General of the United
pour sa
Nations
déclaration
for his
2 jours après celle qu'il a faite
statement
déjà
2 days
pour nous
following the
alerter sur la
statement
gravité
he
de la
made when he
situation.
warned us about just how grave
Remercie
the
également
situation was.
Monsieur
I
le
wish to
Secrétaire
also
Général aux Affaires
thank
Politiques,
the Assistant
Miroslav
Secretary
Janka,
General,
ainsi que Monsieur le Directeur
Mr.
Général de
Miroslav
l'Agence
Janka, and I
internationale de
thank the
l'énergie
Director
atomique,
General for the
Monsieur Raphaël
International
Grossi, pour
Atomic
leurs
Energy
exposés
Agency, Mr.
qui
Raphael
attestent
Grossi. I thank
de
them all for their
l'extrême
briefings
gravité de la
that bear
situation.
witness to to the extremely grave nature of the situation. Madam President, it is with concern that France learned of the strikes conducted by the United States against 3 nuclear sites in Iran. France did not participate neither in the planning nor conduct of these operations. We urge all parties to demonstrate the utmost restraint and to prevent any and all risks of escalation. Now is the time for strikes to cease, for de-escalation and for negotiation. Civilian populations must be spared at a time when strikes exchanged between Iran and Israel have produced too many civilian victims. We particularly call upon Iran to refrain from all reprisals, to cease its nuclear escalation and to opt for diplomacy, as we encouraged them to do on last Friday in Geneva. That was also the message conveyed by the President of the Republic, Emmanuel Macron, to his Iranian counterpart during a talk today. It is of imperative importance to guarantee the region's stability. The President of the Republic also spoke today with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, the Sultan of Oman, the President of UAE and the Emir of Qatar to convey that we were fully engaged on this matter. The conflict broadening in scope would pose a grave risk to Israel's security, for the security of the region and for international peace and security. That is the common message espoused by the President of the Republic and shared with Britain and Germany and their leaders. We took note of the statements made by the IAEA, according to which no increase in levels of radioactivity had been seen around the sites struck. I here support France's full support for the DG of the IAEA and its personnel. Once again, in difficult circumstances, the personnel and the Director General are demonstrating their professionalism and devotion. Iran must, as a matter of urgency, return to the path of full cooperation with the agency. Madam President, we've always affirmed that Iran must not and could not ever obtain a nuclear weapon. Iran acquiring such a weapon would constitute a threat for the security of Israel in the region. It would also pose a direct threat to the security interests of France and Europe and would imperil the international non-proliferation architecture. France's position has remained unchanged for more than 20 years. There is only a diplomatic solution to the crisis provoked by the Iranian nuclear program. That conviction in recent days prompted France alongside its E3 partners to take the initiative of discussions with Iran. The Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs, Jean-Noël Barrot, was in Geneva on Friday for that meeting with his Iranian counterpart and his partners in E3 and the European Union. In that framework, we once again voiced our concerns sparked by the Iranian nuclear program. The dangerous escalation of that program has been documented in recent years by IAEA. They said they were not able to assure its exclusively peaceful nature. We reaffirmed our resolve to ensure that Iran never acquire a nuclear weapon in accordance with its obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the 2015 agreement commitments. We have expressed our desire to continue discussions with Iran to allay concerns raised by the Iranian nuclear program and to address more broadly the security problems posed at a regional level by the destabilizing actions of Iran. This conviction remains today. Only a negotiated diplomatic solution can allow for a lasting settlement to the Iranian nuclear issue. France remains ready to contribute alongside its European partners to seek such a diplomatic solution. We must return to negotiations with a view to achieving a robust, verifiable and long-term solution, vital in order to allow the agency to assure that the Iranian nuclear program is entirely peaceful. That is not the case today. That is the only way that we can guarantee the stability of the region and global peace and security. Madam President, let us never forget that the region in Gaza is already facing a protracted war with devastating humanitarian consequences. We call for an immediate ceasefire, for the unfettered delivery of humanitarian aid throughout the Gaza Strip, and for the immediate unconditional release of hostages. France remains determined to move towards the implementation of a two-state solution, the only solution liable to allow the Palestinians and Israeli people to live in peace and security. We will continue to work towards a resumption of the conference mandated by the General Assembly. France will co-chair that conference with Saudi Arabia. Madam President, this Council will meet once again in 2 days to consider the implementation of Resolution 2231. That meeting must stand as an opportunity for this Council and for Iran to reaffirm their commitment to diplomacy and the spirit of negotiation which prevailed and allowed the conclusion of the 2015 agreement. I thank you.
I thank the representative of France for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Gracias, señora Presidenta.
Thank you, Madam President.
Saludamos y agradecemos al
We
Secretario General
thank the
de las
Secretary
Naciones
General
Unidas,
of the
Su
United
Excelencia
Nations,
Antonio
His Excellency
Guterres,
Antonio
por
Guterres,
su presencia y
for
por su
his
importante
presence
intervención.
and for his important statement.
Extendemos nuestro
We
agradecimiento
extend that gratitude
al Secretario General
to
Adjunto
Assistant
para Europa,
Secretary
Asia
General for
Central y
Europe,
las
Central
Américas,
Asia and the
señor
Americas,
Miroslav
Mr.
Denka,
Miroslav Yencha,
y al Director General
and
del
to the
Organismo
Director
Internacional de
General
Energía
of the
Atómica,
International
señor
Atomic
Rafael
Energy
Grossi,
Agency,
por
Mr.
sus
Rafael
valiosos
Grossi.
aportes.
We thank them
Y
both
damos
for
la
their
bienvenida
invaluable
a las delegaciones de la
contributions.
República
We
Islámica
welcome
de
the
Irán,
delegations
Israel
of the
y
Islamic
Kuwait.
Republic of Iran, Israel and
Observamos con
Kuwait. We note
preocupación
with concern
los
the
recientes
recent
sucesos en Irán.
events in Iran.
Desde el inicio de los
Since the
acontecimientos,
onset of
la
events,
mayoría de los
the
miembros de este
majority of the
Consejo
members of this Council
hemos
have
advertido
warned
la
of
urgente
the
necesidad
urgent need
de
to
desescalar el
de-escalate the
conflicto,
conflict.
así
We've
como también
also
hemos hecho reiterados
repeatedly
llamados a la
appealed
máxima
for utmost
moderación,
restraint to be
al
shown,
diálogo
for
y a las
dialogue
negociaciones para
and for
ofrecerle una
negotiations
oportunidad
to
sensata
give
a la
peace
paz.
a real chance.
Debemos insistir.
We must
Nos
insist
enfrentamos a una situación tan
those
incierta
points.
como
We are facing a
inoportuna,
situation which
cuyas
is as
consecuencias
uncertain as it
podrían
is
ser
unfortunately timed.
profundamente
Its consequences could be
desestabilizadoras,
profoundly
no solo para la
destabilizing,
región,
not only for the
sino para la
region,
paz y la
but
seguridad
for peace,
internacionales.
for international
El
peace and
Organismo
security.
Internacional de
The
Energía
International
Atómica,
Atomic Energy
IAEA,
Agency, the
ha
IAEA,
advertido en sus
has
resoluciones
warned in its
que los
resolutions
ataques a
that
instalaciones
attacks
nucleares
on nuclear facilities
representan un
constitute
riesgo,
a risk,
ya que podrían
because
provocar la
such attacks
liberación de
could
material
trigger the
radioactivo
release of
o
radioactive material.
consecuencias graves
This with
por
grave
contaminación
consequences
radiológica para la
arising
población,
from
para
radiological
el medio
contamination.
ambiente y
These
podrían tener
risks
un impacto regional sin
to the
precedentes.
population, the environment, and could have an
Afortunadamente,
unprecedented
hasta
regional
el
impact.
momento, los hechos
Fortunately, to
recientes
date,
no han
recent
registrado
events
elevaciones
have
en los
not
niveles de radiación
led to
y no se espera que haya
increases in
consecuencias
radiation
para la
levels,
salud
and it is not
de las
expected that
personas
there will
ni
be
para el medio
consequences for the
ambiente
health of
fuera de
people
los
or for the
sitios
environment
afectados,
beyond
de
the
acuerdo con
sites
lo
affected.
señalado
This
por
in
Irán.
accordance with what's been
Por su
indicated
parte,
by
el
Iran.
Organismo Internacional de
Says the
Energía
Speaker.
Atómica
For its
ha
part, the
informado que
International Atomic
continuará
Energy Agency
monitoreando
has
y
stated that it will
evaluando esa
continue
situación
monitoring
en
and
Irán.
evaluating the situation in Iran.
Reconocemos su
We
responsable
recognize
gestión.
the
El
deft,
Tratado
skillful
sobre la no
management
proliferación de
of,
las armas
by the
nucleares,
IAEA.
TNP,
The
es
Treaty
un
of
pilar
on the
esencial del
Non-Proliferation
derecho
of Nuclear
internacional,
Weapons, the NPT,
que ha
is an essential
contribuido de
pillar
manera
of
decisiva
international law.
a
It
la
has
no
made a
proliferación de
decisive
armas
contribution
nucleares
to the
y al
non-proliferation
fomento
of
del
nuclear
desarme.
weapons and to
A
ensuring
través del
disarmament.
TNP, la
Through
comunidad
the
internacional
NPT,
ha
the international
procurado mayores
community has
garantías de
garnered greater
estabilidad y seguridad,
assurances of stability and
reduciendo
security,
el riesgo de que
reducing
las armas
the
nucleares
risks
se
of nuclear
conviertan en
weapons
motivo
becoming
de
a source
confrontación
of
o conflicto.
confrontation or conflict.
Reconocemos
We
que la desconfianza
recognize that
es un
a lack
factor
of trust
agravante en esta
is a
situación.
factor
Sin
exacerbating
embargo,
this
esperamos que aún
situation.
pueda
However, we
existir
hope
algún
that
espacio
some
para el diálogo
room might still
y que
remain for
este Consejo
dialogue. We
puede
hope that this
desempeñar un
Council will
papel
be able to
constructivo
play
para
a
fomentarlo.
constructive role to
Para
encourage
lograrlo,
that dialogue.
todos debemos,
To achieve
desde
that
nuestras
goal, we must
perspectivas,
all, as we can,
exhortar a las partes a
urge
encontrar una
parties
solución
the
que evite
parties
que
to
las
find a
poblaciones
solution which
civiles se
avoids
conviertan
civilian
en víctimas
populations
de un
becoming
conflicto
victims of
aún
an
mayor.
even worse
Señora
conflict.
Presidenta,
Madam President, Panama
país
is a
pequeño,
small country,
pero dueño
but the
responsable
owner,
de un
the
canal
responsible owner
interoceánico
indeed of
estratégico,
a strategic
siempre
interoceanic
apelará al
canal.
derecho
We will
internacional
always have
como
recourse
vía
to
para
international
dirimir
law as
controversias
the pathway
internacionales
through which
que
to resolve
podrían tener
international disputes that
repercusiones a
could
nivel
have
global.
global repercussions.
Por ello,
As such,
respaldamos
we
el cese
support
inmediato
the
de las
immediate
hostilidades
cessation of
con el
hostilities
fin de ofrecer una
with
oportunidad
the
al
goal of
diálogo
offering an
genuino
opportunity
que
to
permita
genuine
construir
dialogue, a
soluciones
dialogue which will
duraderas
allow us
y
to build
pacíficas
lasting and
a los
peaceful
conflictos.
solutions to conflicts.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
I thank the representative of Panama for his statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of China.
Thank you, President. I thank you for convening this emergency open meeting. I also thank Secretary General Guterres for his statement and ASD Yencha and Director General Grossi for their briefings. Yesterday, the United States conducted strikes on 3 Iranian nuclear facilities in Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. China strongly condemns the U.S. attacks on Iran and the bombing of nuclear facilities under the safeguards of the IAEA. The actions of the United States seriously violate the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and international law, as well as Iran's sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity. It has exacerbated tensions in the Middle East and dealt a heavy blow to the international nuclear non-proliferation regime. The international community must uphold justice and make concrete efforts to cool down the situation and restore peace and stability. In this connection, I wish to put forward 4 appeals. First, we call for an immediate ceasefire and ending the hostilities. In the context of the abrupt escalation of tensions in the Middle East, China is deeply concerned about the risk of the situation getting out of control. The parties to the conflict, Israel in particular, should reach an immediate ceasefire to prevent a spiraling escalation and to resolutely avoid the spillover of the war. The parties concerned should abide by international law, curb the impulse to use force, and avoid exacerbating conflicts and adding fuel to the fire. Second, we call for effective protection of civilians. The ultimate victims of all conflicts are the innocent people. China is deeply saddened by the large number of civilian casualties caused by the conflict. Civilians and civilian facilities must not become targets of military operations. And the bottom line of international humanitarian law must not be breached. Parties to the conflict should place the interests and well-being of the people of the countries in the region above everything else, and make every effort to avoid harm to innocent civilians and refrain from attacking civilian facilities. Third, we call for commitment to dialogue and negotiation. Peace in the Middle East cannot be achieved by the use of force. Dialogue and negotiation are the fundamental way out. At present, diplomatic means to address the Iranian nuclear issue haven't been exhausted, and there's still hope for a peaceful solution. Parties should stay firmly committed to the political settlement of the Iranian nuclear issue and work to bring it back onto the track of a political solution through dialogue and negotiation, with a view to reaching an agreement acceptable to all parties. Fourth, we call for swift actions by the Security Council. The Security Council has the primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security, and cannot stand idly by in the face of a major crisis. Russia, China, and Pakistan have proposed a draft resolution calling for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire, the protection of civilians, respect for international law, and engaging in dialogue and negotiation. We hope that Council members can demonstrate their strong sense of responsibility by jointly supporting the draft resolution to enable the Security Council to fulfill its responsibilities for the maintenance of international peace and security. China stands ready to work with the international community to foster synergy, uphold justice, and make unremitting efforts to restore peace and stability in the Middle East. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Thank you, Madam President. Let me start by thanking the Secretary General for his introductory remarks, as well as Assistant Secretary General Gyencha and Director General Grossi for the informative and timely briefings. Madam President, this is the third time in 10 days that this Council has been convened in an emergency meeting, and rightfully so. The situation is now more dangerous than at any point since June 13th. What the Secretary General referred to as a defining moment for our collective future has now become a reality. We have taken note of the military action against nuclear-related sites in Iran and are monitoring with concern the evolving situation very closely. Madam President, allow me to raise the following 3 points. First, we reiterate our call upon all parties to show restraint. There is no need for more violence, especially given the potential grave consequences. It is critical for the IAEA inspectors to be able to resume their activity and check on the status of the stockpiles of the enriched uranium, as well as of the remaining enriching capability have nuclear weapons. We have time and again warned against non-compliance with the legally binding safeguards and JCPOA obligation. Against this background, Israel has the right to protect itself and live in peace and security with its neighbors. We can argue in this chamber, and so many times we have done, on whether Iran's nuclear program was exclusively peaceful or not. However, whatever the case may be, such high levels of enriched uranium in a region as volatile as the Middle East cannot but generate extreme uncertainty and instability. Third, it is of critical importance to ensure that civilians on all sides are protected. Last but not least, we take note with profound relief of DG Gross's remarks that as of this time, we do not expect that there will be any health consequences for people or the environment outside the targeted sites. Madam President, in closing, allow me to highlight, in no uncertain terms, the value of de-escalation as a first step towards a sustainable peace. The international community and countries with influence must step in and offer a diplomatic way out, which must include the necessary security assurances. Involved parties need to act in full compliance with the UN Charter, international law, and international humanitarian law. Echoing the ancient virtue of sophrosyne, self-restraint, we urge all parties to exercise the utmost moderation and engage in dialogue and diplomacy. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece for his statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Madam President. And I also thank the Secretary General for his presence and remarks, and Assistant Secretary Jenka and Director General Grossi for their briefings and updates. Madam President, we are meeting again today as the situation in the Middle East continues to escalate. Attacks between Israel and Iran have continued since our last meeting on Friday. Civilian casualties and widespread suffering continue to rise on both sides. Last night, a targeted operation was carried out by the United States against 3 nuclear facilities in Iran. The continued escalation in the Middle East is a cause for great concern and poses a grave risk to international peace and security. Madam President, Denmark urges all parties to abide by the obligations under the UN Charter and international law. All parties must ensure protections of civilians and civilian infrastructure in line with international humanitarian law. Furthermore, and keeping in mind the words of Director General Grossi 2 days ago to this Council, all actions should be taken and the necessary restraint shown to reduce the risk of nuclear accidents, which could have devastating effects for the civilian population and the environment. Madam President, Denmark has persistently underlined that Iran must never acquire a nuclear weapon. That would be a serious threat to regional and global security. We have repeatedly expressed our concerns about Iran's accelerating nuclear trajectory and the fact that the IAEA is unable to assure that the Iranian nuclear program is exclusively peaceful. We welcome that the IAEA continues to monitor the situation and provide information on the nuclear safety and security implications. And we stress the importance of continued and timely exchange of information between Iran and the IAEA regarding issues related to nuclear safety, security, and safeguards. Madam President, the current trajectory is unsustainable and fraught with danger, not only for the region, but for international peace and security at large. De-escalation is not only necessary, it is urgent. We call on all actors to step back from the brink to prevent further escalation in the Middle East. We urge Iran to engage in negotiations and not to take any further action that could destabilize the region. At this critical moment, it is important that all parties refrain from steps that could lead to serious regional and global consequences. We further stress the need to protect maritime security and international trade routes, including via the Strait of Hormuz. Madam President, in closing, now is the time to return to negotiations in order to reach a diplomatic solution. We call on all parties to exercise the utmost restraint and to engage in a diplomatic negotiated solution, which is the only viable path towards lasting peace in the region and beyond. Denmark stands ready to work with all parties to that effect. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Denmark for her statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Madam President, we're grateful to the Presidency of Guyana for swiftly convening today's meeting of the UN Security Council, linked to the acutely dangerous development we've seen in the Middle East, developments which have been further exacerbated by the overnight US strikes on Iranian sites. We'd like to thank the UNSC for his keynote address, as well as to ASG Yencha and DG Grossi for their briefings. Russia condemns in the most decisive terms the irresponsible, dangerous, and provocative actions committed by the USA against the Islamic Republic of Iran, a sovereign member state of the United Nations. As we know, in the early hours on the 22nd of June, the US Air Force, in full cooperation and coordination with the Israeli Air Force, an air force which for over a week, in violation of the basic principles of international law, has been conducting massive strikes on Iranian infrastructure and sites, they together launched an unprovoked missile and bomb attack on 3 nuclear sites in Iran, sites under IAEA safeguards, Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. In so doing, Washington yet again demonstrated its complete contempt for the position of the international community. Washington reasserted that to further the interests of its Israeli ally, it's prepared not only to turn a blind eye to the killings of tens of thousands of Palestinian women, children, and older persons, but also to gamble with the safety and well-being of humanity as a whole. Through their actions, the US has opened a Pandora's box. No one knows what new catastrophes and suffering it will bring. In the last 10 days, we heard 3 briefings from the IAEA DG, Mr. Rafael Grossi. He cautioned that strikes on Iranian nuclear infrastructure could have absolutely unpredictable repercussions, as well as that they pose a major threat to both the nuclear safety and security, not only in Iran, but also in the region and the world. Yet Washington is completely unconcerned. It's unconcerned by either the radiological consequences nor the threat to the lives and health of a huge number of people, civilians including women and children, in the region and beyond. Washington, much like West Jerusalem, sees itself as the highest judge in the land, vested with the right to mete out justice as it sees fit. Thus, the US has confirmed that in order to safeguard their global hegemony, it's prepared to commit any crimes, any violations of international law. Let me remind you that no one gave the US the authority to act in such a way. We insistently offered our US colleagues our mediation services so as to find a peaceful, mutually agreeable solution surrounding the Iranian nuclear program. Yet our US colleagues are clearly not interested in diplomacy today. Responsibility for this falls squarely on the shoulders of the US leadership, especially given that it is the US leadership that not only publicly acknowledged its responsibility for these actions, but actually flaunted it, demonstrating wholesale disregard for the norms of international law and the UN Charter, as well as Security Council resolutions, including Resolution 487 and Resolution 2231, as well as the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT. Madam President, just 2 days ago, here in this very chamber, we heard from many delegations, including the closest allies of the US. They called for a de-escalation and for the settlement of differences around the negotiating table. Yet our US colleagues yet again ignored this position, the position of the entire international community, following Israel's lead, instead of checking Israel, instead of forcing it to halt the spiral of escalation. Today, we once again will be hearing from the US representative. We'll be hearing cynical statements about readiness to return to the negotiations table, as if there were no strikes using heavy payload bombs on Iran. Clearly, this is being done to hypercritically subsequently portray Tehran as the party that spoiled the negotiations process, the party that's supposedly undermining stability in the Middle East. Yet we believe that none of our sensible colleagues in the international community will believe our US colleagues anymore, much like they won't believe their attempts to convince the Security Council that Iran was trying to acquire nuclear weapons. Let me remind you that back in March, high-ranking U.S. intelligence officials said that the U.S. does not have information about Tehran's attempts to develop military nuclear capabilities. I imagine that many are getting a nagging sense of déjà vu today. Let me remind you that back in 2003, in this very chamber, the U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell waved around a test tube, justifying Washington's plans to invade the territory of another sovereign state, only to having waged decades of chaos onto its people to not find any WMDs there. Today's situation is no different in substance to the one we saw in 2003. Again, we're being asked to believe the US's fairy tales to once again inflict suffering on millions of people living in the Middle East. This cements our conviction that history has taught our US colleagues nothing. We regret that today some of you in this room didn't and cannot muster up the courage to call a spade and to condemn Washington's actions. And it's very strange to be participating in this theatre of the absurd, this cynical theatre. We had the representative of the UK calling on Iran to exercise restraint, a country which was subjected to an unprovoked attack, which was bombed. It had its nuclear sites bombed, as if it were Iran, not Israel, and the US that was escalating the situation as much as possible. They're calling on Iran to exercise restraint. This is something other council members are doing. We've seen a lot of hypocrisy in this room, but this takes the biscuit. This is a surprising example of hypocrisy on the part of those who, over the last few days, has been whipping up tensions regarding Resolution 2231, which will soon expire. Madam President, throughout the last week, we witnessed a new, highly dangerous wave of escalation. Last night, the situation became wholly unprecedented in nature. The radiological repercussions of the US attacks remain to be assessed, and we're counting on the IAEA and its Director General to issue a clear-cut, professional and impartial analysis of the situation, including by presenting an objective report at the emergency session of the Board of Governors of the IAEA. Yet it's already clear that strikes on Iran's nuclear sites, including those conducted by one of the NPT's depositories, the US, that these attacks amount to a colossal attack on the global NPT regime, non-proliferation regime. They not only deal a blow to the authority of the IAEA, they also deal a blow to the entire system of inspections and control implemented by the agency. They also destroy the basis of the system of international cooperation, including de facto risking casting us back into the era of nuclear risks. Seemingly, this is what Washington and Western Jerusalem are seeking. The Russian Federation, as a responsible state and a permanent member of the Security Council, cannot abide such a scenario. We cannot support it. Iran, as per the NPT, has the right to develop its civilian nuclear program. Overnight, the US has de facto nullified years of diplomatic efforts aimed at ensuring compliance with this fundamental principle. Agreeing with the legality of US actions is tantamount to throwing out all of the international community's advances on this front. And since we talked about the importance of the NPT and the global non-proliferation regime today, I'd like to remind you that Israel has not yet acceded to the NPT. Thus, there cannot be a comprehensive IAEA inspections program vis-à-vis Israel. As for Iran, in keeping, I'd like to remind you that Israel has not acceded to the NPT, so no comprehensive IAEA inspections program vis-à-vis Israel is being implemented. As for Iran, Iran was and remains the most monitored IAEA state in the world. And instead of supporting Iran, we're getting bombardments of this country, including its civilians. This is a country, and this is being done by a country which has, in principle, refused to sign the NPT. This is an outrageous, cynical situation. It's very strange that the IAEA DG did not say a word about this, nor did he call on Israel to join the NPT, not once. Madam President, I think that everyone in this room can see full well that unless we stop the escalation, the Middle East will find itself on the verge of a large-scale conflict with unpredictable consequences for the entire international security system. Plus, the entire world might end up on the verge of a nuclear disaster. We call for an immediate cessation of aggressive actions by Israel and the US, restraint on the part of all parties, and return into the fold of international diplomacy and the negotiations process. Yet calls on the part of UN Security Council members are not enough. Based on the provisions of the UN Charter, and these are the very same provisions that those who are hypocritically staying silent today call for the respect for in other cases. On the basis of these provisions, the Security Council is simply duty-bound to craft a collective decision which would make unacceptable strikes on Iranian nuclear infrastructure, which are under IAEA safeguards. To this end, we need, first and foremost, a clear-cut legal and political assessment of what happened. For all those who are not pursuing any hidden agendas nor double standards, this is patently obvious. To this end, the Russian Federation, China and Pakistan have prepared and disseminated this morning a short and balanced UN Security Council draft resolution, including a call for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire and for a search for a diplomatic solution surrounding the Iranian nuclear program. The text reflects the positions of an overwhelming majority of Security Council members expressed at our meetings held on the 13th and 20th of June. We're counting on the support of all Security Council members to ensure that the Council can, as soon as possible, send a signal about the need to immediately end the violence, something that the Secretary General again called for, inter alia. Unless the Security Council takes a clear-cut and principled position, further escalation is inevitable. We call on all Security Council members to adopt a responsible approach and to support the proposed draft. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation, and I give the floor now to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you, Secretary General Antonio Guterres, Assistant Secretary General Miroslav Jenča, and Director General Rafael Grossi for your continued attention on this urgent matter of international peace and security. Madam President, last evening, U.S. military strikes targeted nuclear facilities in Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan with the aim of dismantling Iran's nuclear enrichment capacity and stopping the nuclear threat posed by the world's foremost state sponsor of terror. This operation sought to eliminate a long-standing but rapidly escalating source of global insecurity and to aid our ally Israel in our inherent right of collective self-defense, consistent with the UN Charter. For 40 years, the Iranian government has called for death to America and death to Israel, and posed a constant menace to the peace and security of its neighbors, the United States, and the entire world. Iran has attacked Israel with hundreds of ballistic missiles and through terrorist proxies. For decades, Iran has been responsible for misery and countless deaths across the Middle East. Iran's government and its proxies have also killed numerous Americans, including American service members in Iraq and Afghanistan. In recent weeks, Iranian officials have intensified their hostile bluster and rhetoric. Iran has long obfuscated its nuclear weapons program and stonewalled good faith efforts in recent negotiations. Madam President, the time finally came for the United States, in the defense of its ally and in the defense of our own citizens and interests, to act decisively. The Iranian regime cannot have a nuclear weapon. Let us be clear. Iran should not escalate. As President Trump said, any Iranian attack, direct or indirect, against Americans or American bases will be met with devastating retaliation. To fulfill its core mission of maintaining international peace and security, this Council must call upon the Iranian regime to end its 47-year effort to eradicate the State of Israel, to terminate its drive for nuclear weapons, to stop targeting American citizens and interests, and to negotiate peace in good faith for the prosperity and security of the Iranian people and all other states in the region. Madam President, a member state here today cast aspersions about hypocrisy and raised the forthcoming meeting on UN Security Council Resolution 2231. In that regard, I would point out that the recent IAEA report on verification and monitoring of Iran's noncompliance with obligatory nuclear safeguards shows clearly that Iran has been continuing to accelerate its nuclear activities without any credible civilian justification. We look forward to discussing the implications of this report and its broader implications on Tuesday, when the Secretariat briefs on the report on implementation of UNSCR 2231. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United States for her statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Madam President. Secretary General, thank you very much for your remarks. And thank you also to Director General Grossi and Secretary General, Assistant Secretary General Jenča for their briefings. Madam President, this body is mandated to work for maintenance of international peace and security. There are moments in this chamber and outside, pivotal moments that shape our collective future. We believe today's debate is one of them. Slovenia denounces the sharp military escalation. This escalation risks to further exacerbate an already extremely dangerous and unstable regional situation and is threatening international peace and security. Therefore, we join the Secretary General's call on the parties to the conflict to disengage from further escalation and retaliation. We call for an immediate ceasefire. Madam President, we further call on the parties to the conflict to respect the UN Charter and international law, including the international humanitarian law. As we have been proven time and time again, violence and military conflicts lead nowhere but to an ever greater suffering of the innocent people of the Middle East. We are deeply alarmed about the toll of the ongoing situation on civilians, the chaos and the fear it is sowing. Madam President, Slovenia remains concerned about the size and unclear nature of Iran's nuclear program. We reaffirm our firm rejection of nuclear proliferation. At this point, I wish to express our full support to the work of the International Atomic Energy Agency and to you, DG Grossi. At this critical moment, with so much at stake, we must insist on diplomacy. A tailored diplomatic solution is needed. We welcome attempts of maintaining a diplomatic path in the recent days, namely the meeting of the E3 and the EU with Iran, and call on everyone else to follow this path. We call on the parties to the conflict and those with influence on them to prioritize diplomacy and peace and to return to the negotiating table. This must include Iran's nuclear question, leading us to establishing a credible, comprehensive, and verifiable solution, as well as dealing with other regional crises, including Gaza. Madam President, let me repeat. This is not a time for further escalations. This is not a time for retaliatory measures. It is time for de-escalation and diplomacy. It is time for peace. And we call on all leaders to show leadership for peace. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for her statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Somalia.
Madam President, at the outset, Somalia wishes to thank the Presidency for convening the Council again in response to escalating and grave developments in the Middle East. We also extend our appreciation to the Secretary General for his introductory remarks and to DG Grossi and ASG Janka for their thorough updates on this worrying and rapidly evolving threat to international peace and security in the Middle East. The recent attacks on nuclear facilities of Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan in Iran represent a perilous escalation that threatens to engulf the entire region in an uncontrollable cycle of violence, suffering, and destruction. Somalia condemns any acts of aggression that violate the sovereignty and territorial integrity of member states. Such actions are in clear contravention of the principles enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations, in particular Article 2, Paragraph 4, which prohibits the threat or use of force against any state. We reaffirm the importance of respecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Our delegation believes that all member states share responsibility to act in accordance with these principles and commitments. Madam President, at this critical moment, 4 urgent actions must guide our collective response. First, uphold international law and the UN Charter. We call for respect of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states and adhere to the principles of good neighborliness and to resolve disputes through peaceful means. Violations of these principles imperil countless lives and deepen regional crisis. Second, pursue de-escalation and comprehensive ceasefire. We urge all sides to work towards de-escalation and achieve immediate and unconditional ceasefire in order to restore calm and confidence-building measures. The Security Council must support every diplomatic initiative aimed at reducing tensions and preventing further conflict. Third, the return to negotiations on non-proliferation. Somalia reaffirms the urgent necessity of returning to negotiations regarding the Iranian nuclear program. Our delegation believes that the only viable path forward is a swift recommitment to talks on non-proliferation in line with relevant international resolutions. We further reiterate our call for the establishment of a Middle East zone free of nuclear weapons and for all regional states to join the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation and Nuclear Weapons. Lastly, protection of civilians and safeguarding nuclear facilities. We emphasize the paramount importance of protecting civilians and civilian infrastructure. Also, we urge all parties to exercise restraint and refrain from targeting nuclear facilities, particularly under IAEA safeguards, given the grave risks such actions pose to populations, regional stability, and the environment. Equally important is to guarantee freedom of navigation in international waterways and to refrain from actions that undermine maritime security. To conclude, Madam President, the challenges before us demand a collective, measured response rooted in dialogue, mutual respect, and a renewed commitment to multilateralism. Our delegation stands ready to engage constructively with the international community to advance peace, stability, and security for all states in the Middle East. We urge all parties to act with responsibility and wisdom, placing the well-being of the region's people above all other considerations. Our delegation echoes the SG call to give peace a chance and reiterates its call to seize this moment to redouble efforts for de-escalation and a return to negotiations and a sustainable diplomatic process. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Somalia for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Madam President, for convening this yet another emergency meeting of the Security Council. And I would also like to join colleagues in thanking the Secretary General for his remarks. You couldn't be clearer than that, Secretary General. Thank you. I would also like to thank ASG Shenka and Director General Grossi for their important briefings. Madam President, when the Security Council met for the second time last Friday, following Israel's wanton continuing aggression and unprovoked strikes against Iran, many members warned the international community of this grave violation of the UN Charter and the risk of dangerous escalation. We have heard the same today around the table from Council members as well as the Secretary General and other briefers. But tragically, developments over the past 24 hours have only confirmed those warnings. And it is unfortunate that the universal calls for de-escalation and a peaceful resolution of this crisis through dialogue have remained unheeded. From the outset, Pakistan has adopted a principled position on these developments, a position based entirely on international law and the UN Charter. We have thus strongly and unambiguously condemned the Israeli aggression, expressed solidarity and full support for Iran's inherent and legitimate right of self-defense in conformity with the Charter of the United Nations, denounced the unlawful Israeli unilateral strikes on IAEA safeguarded Iranian nuclear facilities, called for bringing an end to this aggression, advocated cessation of hostilities and for reverting to dialogue and diplomacy for a peaceful, lasting settlement of the Iranian nuclear issue. In recent days, Pakistan's leadership, including the Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, has remained actively engaged in promoting those objectives through numerous and continuing contacts with leaders of other countries and our partners across regions, all in the interest of preserving international peace and security and in fulfillment of our responsibility as a member of the Security Council. The Council of Foreign Ministers of the OIC meeting in Istanbul has echoed the same call for ending the aggression and supporting de-escalation and a peaceful settlement. It is in this context that we are seriously concerned by the recent developments that have further heightened tensions. Pakistan has condemned the US strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities, which come on the heels of a series of brazen attacks by Israel on the nuclear sites. Let me recall that specific targeting of nuclear facilities under IAEA safeguards constitutes a clear breach of international law, the IAEA statute, multiple IAEA resolutions, as well as Security Council Resolution 487. And according to Article 25 of the Charter, the members of the United Nations agree to accept and carry out the decisions of the Security Council in accordance with the Charter. That responsibility to carry out the decisions of the Security Council is heaviest with the members of this Council, particularly the permanent members in the first place. Madam President, we are deeply alarmed by the escalating situation. The sharp rise in tensions and violence as a result of the Israeli aggression and unlawful actions is profoundly disturbing. Any further escalation risks catastrophic consequences for the region and beyond. Pakistan stands in solidarity with the government and brotherly people of Iran during this challenging time. Madam President, these attacks set a dangerous precedent and pose a grave threat to the safety and security of populations across the region, and indeed the world. As the body entrusted with primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security, the Security Council must act urgently and decisively. We share a collective responsibility to, first, unequivocally reject and condemn the attacks against the Islamic Republic of Iran since 13th of June, being in clear contravention of international law and the UN Charter. Threat or use of force must never be condoned. Article 2.4 is clear, crystal clear in this regard, and so is Article 51. Second, denounce the attacks on IAEA safeguarded nuclear facilities, which violate Security Council and IAEA resolutions as well as international humanitarian law. Third, reaffirm the obligation to protect civilian lives and property on both sides. All parties must adhere fully to international law, particularly international humanitarian law. Fourth, call for an immediate cessation of hostilities and a complete ceasefire. Fifth, promote urgent recourse to dialogue and diplomacy consistent with the purposes and principles of the UN Charter to find a peaceful and lasting resolution to the Iranian nuclear issue. Madam President, in pursuit of these objectives, Pakistan has joined China and Russia in circulating a draft resolution. Among other things, this resolution calls for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire, urges all parties to refrain from further escalation, demands the urgent protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure, and supports a diplomatic path forward on the Iranian nuclear issue that is acceptable to all parties. And listening to similar concerns and priorities expressed by many of the Council members today, we sincerely hope that the draft resolution will receive the Council's support, enabling it to respond with unity and resolve urgently and effectively in line with the gravity of the situation. And Pakistan stands ready to engage constructively with all Council members in this regard. Madam President, the Middle East, already burdened by prolonged instability, history of Israeli illegal occupation, and continued denial of the Palestinian right to self-determination and statehood, cannot absorb another crisis. We must act now to prevent the situation from spiraling further out of control. History has taught us that the use of force and unilateral military actions only deepen conflicts and entrench divisions, with tragic human and humanitarian consequences. Dialogue and diplomacy remain the only path forward. These must be pursued with seriousness and sincerity by all. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Madam President, I would like to thank you for the prompt scheduling of this meeting. I thank the Secretary General for his remark. We share your assessment that this is a dangerous escalation in the region already on the edge. And we echo your pressing call on member states to de-escalate and to uphold their obligation under the UN Charter and other rules of international law. I also thank ASG Jenka and Director General Grossi for their briefings. Madam President, the world, and especially the Middle East, cannot endure another war. Unfortunately, events in the region are accelerating in an alarming pace, pushing the Middle East dangerously close to an apocalyptic scenario. At a time when the international community was united, yes, was united in seeking ways to ease tensions, the situation has deteriorated sharply yesterday and further exacerbated by American strikes targeting Iranian nuclear facilities. Algeria expresses its deep concern and regret over this grave development, which significantly worsens the security and exposes the entire region to unprecedented risks with potentially uncontainable consequences. The erosion of the international nuclear security architecture poses a grave threat not only to regional stability, but also to the global peace and security. Attacks on nuclear facilities under international safeguards seriously undermine the integrity and credibility of the global non-proliferation regime. Therefore, we reaffirm that the legal framework safeguarding nuclear installations is clear, is comprehensive, is binding. Its very existence is precisely to ensure the highest levels of safety and protection for such facilities. The resolution of the IAEA General Conference repeatedly and explicitly state that, I quote, any armed attack on and threat against nuclear facilities devoted to peaceful purposes constitute a violation of the principles of the United Nations Charter, the international law, and the statute of the agency. These resolutions remain fully valid and applicable to the current situation. Under no circumstances should nuclear facilities be subject to attack. Upholding international law is not optional. It is a binding obligation upon all member states. Madam President, what lies ahead? What space remains for diplomacy? What responsibility rests with this Security Council? What we are witnessing today is a profound and perilous reversal. War has become the denial of diplomacy and politics by all means. Diplomacy, our job, long regarded as the primary tool for conflict resolution, is now being compelled to yield, to step aside, to allow force to take precedence. And this Council, for some, and especially for Middle East issues, its restraint, its silence, yes, silence, is seen as more useful than its action. What then of negotiation, of agreements, of the essence of the United Nations, its charter, its principles, and of international law. They too are being bypassed, negated, disregarded, and finally, discredited. Future generations will remember not only what we said, but what we did, or what we failed to do. We, the Security Council members, especially the elected one. Madam President, including the lifting of sanctions. Should I remind what the Charter clearly states? I quote, "All members shall settle their international dispute by peaceful means." End of quote. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for his statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as representative of Guyana. I thank you, Secretary General Antonio Guterres, for your presence here today and for your remarks. I also express our appreciation to Assistant Secretary General Miroslav Jenča and IAEA Director General Grossi for responding swiftly to our urgent request to brief the Security Council. Colleagues, just 2 days ago, we met in these chambers and made urgent calls for diplomacy and de-escalation in relation to the ongoing conflict between Israel and Iran. The Secretary General appealed to give peace a chance, and many of us echoed that call. Guyana, like so many other countries, including on this Council, has consistently called for Israel and Iran to exercise maximum restraint and to avoid any miscalculations that would further plunge the region into deeper crisis. Colleagues, for months, we have listened to the increasingly dangerous rhetoric and threats. However, what we need at this time is leadership and diplomacy. In this context, Guyana offers the following considerations. First, what is unfolding in the Middle East concerns us all. We must renew our calls for de-escalation and urge the concerned parties to step back and return to diplomacy and dialogue. We call on influential states to encourage the parties in this direction. Resist the temptation to fan the flames of conflict, given the potentially grave humanitarian and security impacts, as well as the attendant effects on global trade, including oil prices and food security. Second, we urge the members of this Council to urgently address the grave threat posed by this conflict to international peace and security, to uphold their obligations under the UN Charter, and take decisive action to end the hostilities. We must ensure that the parties avoid being trapped in a retaliatory tit-for-tat loop of violence that undermines regional and global peace and security. Finally, the headwinds we face are indeed testing our collective resolve. Guyana reiterates its call for all parties to abide by the principles of the United Nations Charter and to respect and uphold international humanitarian law, particularly the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution, and ensure the protection of civilians and civilian objects. We also reiterate that the right to self-defense absolves neither party of their responsibilities and obligations under international law. I thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council. Before opening the floor, I would like to remind all speakers that this is a formal meeting of the United Nations Security Council and of the need to ensure proper decorum in the delivery of their statements and to refrain from personal attacks. I now give the floor to the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Thank you. In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful, thank you, Madam President, for your valuable effort to promptly convening this emergency meeting in your capacity as the President of the Security Council. We welcome the presence of Secretary General at this meeting, and we also listen to the statement made by the ASG, Mr. Jenka. We appreciate all those members who have chosen to stand on the right side of history and thus strongly condemned the act of aggression of the United States and the Israeli regime against my country. Madam President, I address this Council today for the third time since the brutal aggression against my country, first by the Israeli regime on June 13th and now by the United States. I speak with utmost urgency and grave concern on behalf of our people, a peace-loving nation of nearly 100 million people. Today, another stain was recorded in the political history of the United States. After the illegitimate Israeli regime failed to do the worst dirty work, Trump was forced in the early hours of Sunday, June 22, to personally carry out the most sordid part of this vile agenda. Once again, the internationally wanted war criminal Netanyahu succeeded in hijacking U.S. foreign policy, dragging the United States into yet another costly, baseless war. America has once more recklessly chosen to sacrifice its own security merely to safeguard Netanyahu. Once again, the world has witnessed the blatant corruption of the U.S. political system and its leaders. As an independent, peace-seeking nation, the Islamic Republic of Iran had repeatedly warned the warmongering U.S. regime to refrain from stumbling into this quagmire. Even though Iran reserves its full and legitimate right under international law to defend itself against this blatant U.S. aggression and its Israeli proxy, the timing, nature, and scale of Iran's proportionate response will be decided by its armed forces. Throughout history, the resilient and united Iranian nation has withstood deeper wounded and faced more vicious enemies, and this time too. It will show its dignity, strength, and greatness to the world. Over the past 10 days, the Israeli barbaric assault, the international bodies, including the UN Security Council and the International Atomic Energy Agency, have been provided with all the necessary information and warning. Yet, they have proven once again that the so-called 8 decades-long quest to prevent war and aggression is hollow and powerless in practice. Madam President, history will not forget these tragic days. It is profoundly heartbreaking that a peace-loving country, one of the founders of the United Nations with over 5,000 years of culture and civilization, responsible party to the UN Charter and the NPT, and non-nuclear weapon state, has been under armed attack by an illegitimate regime, no by its chief backer, the United States, but poses thousands of nuclear warheads. The United States, a permanent member of this council, the depositary of the NPT, and the only state that has ever used nuclear weapons, murdering millions in 2 cities, has now once again resorted to illegal force, waged a war against my country under a fabricated and absurd pretext, preventing Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. What a bitter and tragic irony. Madam President, this US and Israeli regime aggression is a clear and flagrant breach of international law. It breaches the preliminary norms of prohibition of aggression and the very fundamental principles enshrined in the UN Charter, namely Article 2.4, which categorically prohibits the threat or use of force against the sovereignty and territorial integrity of any member state. This illegal act also violates the Charter, a statute of the IAEA, relevant resolution of the Agency General Conference, Security Council Resolution 487 and 2231, as well as the NPT itself. Colleagues, while the representative of the United States continues to make baseless accusations against Iran, the international community is well aware of the well-documented and dark record of military intervention, illegal use of force against other sovereign states, and a sponsorship of terrorism by the United States in the Middle East and across the world. The facts speak for themselves. All US allegations against Iran are unfounded, with no legal basis and politically motivated. One clear example is the horrific and cowardly assassination of martyr Major General Qasem Soleimani and his companions. He was cowardly and deliberately assassinated while visiting Iraq at the formal request of the Iraqi government. This crime, carried out by the United States forces on direct order of the then President of the United States, who yesterday again claims the responsibility for such a heinous crime. Major General Soleimani remains a hero for our people and the nation in the region for countering terrorist groups, in particular Daesh. Madam President, from its illegal invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan to its catastrophic intervention to Libya, the United States had ignored the UN Charter, shattered entire societies, and destabilized the region for decades. The people of these countries continue to pay the price for these reckless policies. Madam President, Israeli attack on June 13 and the US aerial strike on June 21 did not occur in vacuum. They are a direct result of the illegal and politically motivated actions of the United States and its European partners, the United Kingdom, France, and Germany, as well as biased conduct of the IAEA Director General. Undoubtedly, the United States, the UK, and France, 3 permanent members of this Council, along with the Israeli regime and the IAEA General Director, will bear full responsibility for the death of innocent civilians in Iran, especially women and children, and for destruction of vital civilian infrastructure. Madam President, Iran was preparing for the next round of diplomatic engagement with the United States on June 15, only for Israel to strike Iran 2 days before those talks could take place. In fact, Israel decided to destroy diplomacy. The so-called offer of diplomacy was nothing more than a deceitful policy to mislead the international community. This week, as our foreign minister held talks with the E3 European Troika and the European Union, the United States decided to destroy the diplomacy. What conclusion can be drawn from this situation? From the perspective of Western countries, Iran must return to the negotiation table. But as Iran's foreign minister mentioned, how can Iran return to something it never left, let alone? Madam President, the pattern is evident. The NPT, a cornerstone of non-proliferation regime, has been manipulated into a political weapon. Instead of granting parties legitimate right to peaceful nuclear energy, it has been exploited as a pretext for aggression and unlawful action that jeopardize the supreme interest of my country. The selective double standards behavior of IAEA board and the Security Council turning a blind eye to Israeli past attack on Iraq's Osirak reactor. It assaults on Iran nuclear sites under IAEA safeguards, and its ongoing aggression is a moral, political, and legal disgrace. This shame will forever tarnish the credibility of these international bodies. With such blatant bias, there is no assurance that the other NPT member will not face similar aggression. Madam President, for more than 2 decades, Israeli, an outlaw nuclear-armed regime that refused to join the NPT despite Security Council Resolution 487, has promoted the deceitful and false narrative that Iran is on the cusp of acquiring a nuclear weapon, while there has not been even one shred of evidence to substantiate such baseless allegation. Iran's consistent diplomatic engagement made in good faith, leading to the JCPOA and its full compliance with the commitment therein with the UN Security Council Resolution 2231, demonstrate the very peaceful nature of its nuclear program. Madam President, Iran is acting within its inherent unlawful right of self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter. We will take all measures deemed necessary at our disposal to protect our people, our sovereignty, territorial integrity, national and vital interest, and our peaceful nuclear program in accordance with international law. Once again, I would like to remind this esteemed body of its legal and moral obligation. If this Council and the United Nations built to maintain international peace and security fail to act at this decisive moment, they will forever lose their credibility and relevance. Israel and the United States are the chief culprits for eroding the rule of law, undermining international law, the IAEA statute, and the non-proliferation regime. However, the silence, double standards, and complicity of international organizations and some Western countries, including France and the UK, are equally reprehensible. The UN Security Council should immediately act under Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter to redress such injustice and gross violation by strongly condemning the blatant aggression, violation, and heinous crimes committed against the Islamic Republic of Iran, adopting effective enforcement action against the aggressor, hold the United States and Israeli regime fully accountable, place the Israeli nuclear facilities under agency safeguard. This is a historic test for this Council, for the United Nations as a whole. Every state and every responsible actor must rise to this occasion and condemn without ambiguity These blatant crimes, failure to do so will lead to the gradual decline of the very aspiration of the non-proliferation regime and normalize a dangerous precedent when might, our rights, right, and where the fundamental principles of the UN Charter are trampled without consequences. Madam President, distinguished colleagues, we stand at the crossroads. Let us be the moment we put an end to impunity, the moment we uphold the principles on which this Council was founded. This Council must act decisively. Silence will be complicity in these crimes. If this Council fails to act and condemn this blatant aggression, the stain of complicity will forever remain on its conscience as it does with Gaza. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Madam President. First, I would like to thank the Secretary General, ASG Yancha, Director General Grossi, for your remarks. Madam President, last night, history changed. The United States of America struck Iran's nuclear sites at Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. The United States, the leader of the free world, removed the greatest existential threat facing the free world. Just like our Operation Rising Lion, this was not a war of choice. This action was a necessity. It was a righteous act for the United States, for Israel, for the Middle East, and for the world. So the entire world should say on record today, here and now, thank you. Thank you to the United States for removing the greatest threat to global security. Thank you, President Trump, for acting when so many hesitated. Thank you for protecting the free world with strength and with moral clarity. Now, some come here to denounce the United States and Israel. So let me ask you, where were you? Where were you when Iran raced toward the bomb? Where were you when it enriched uranium far beyond the point of civilian usage? When it buried entire fortress beneath mountain to prepare for our extermination? Where were you when Iran turned negotiation into theater and deceit into strategy? You were silent. You were complicit. You were afraid. You were bystanders. Months ago, I sat before this council and called for a coalition of the courageous. I called for a coalition with the moral clarity and strength to confront the greatest threat our world has seen since the Second World War. Last night, the leader of the free world acted with that courage. The United States acted, not just for itself, but for every nation that values freedom over radicalism, for every nation whose children deserve to grow up without the shadow of a nuclear disaster hanging over their heads. Now, the world must follow suit. Madam President, we have heard many calls for diplomacy today in this chamber. We have heard the Secretary General calls for de-escalation. You cannot ignore that diplomacy was tried over and over. The United States led that effort. Many nations here in this room engaged in diplomacy with determination and good faith. But the regime in Tehran had other plans. It used the negotiating table as camouflage, a delay tactic, a way to buy time while building missiles and enriching uranium. Iran negotiated agreements it never intended to keep. It made commitments it never honored. It answered deadlines with defiance and met oversight with obstruction. The free world gave it every chance. We gave it months, we gave it years, we gave it every possible off-ramp. Iran would not move. so it had to be moved. The regime goal was never peaceful energy. Its goal was death and destruction. Its nuclear program was not a diplomatic puzzle. It was a loaded gun pointed at the heart of the international system and the stability of the world. To those who now fake concern and cry escalation, we say, this is what the last line of defense looks like, when every other line has failed. Make no mistake, the cost of inaction would have been catastrophic. A nuclear Iran would have been a death sentence just as much for you as it would have been for us. Madam President, while Iran fired rockets at synagogues, mosques, schools, and homes, the United States acted with precision, as does Israel. Israel's targets are not cities. They were not civilians. They were not homes or schools. They are ballistic missile launchers and nuclear sites. This is a moral difference between us and them. They seek chaos, we seek order. They build weapons to destroy the world, we build partnerships to protect it. As you all know, we have already gained air superiority across Iranian skies. We have acted with purpose. We have acted with restraint. And we will act with the moral clarity that has always defined our people. Iran's reach extends far beyond our borders. It arms militias in Iraq. It commands terror in Lebanon. It funds Houthis in Yemen. It plots murder in Europe. And it threatens every capital in the West with its growing arsenal of ballistic missiles. You cannot sit this one out. You cannot condemn the firefighters while the arsonist tries to light more fires. You cannot protect peace by appeasing evil. Colleagues, Israel did not seek this moment, but when that moment came, we did not flinch. We know what happens when the world turns a blind eye to threats too terrible to imagine. This time, we acted, and this time, we were not alone. Let the record show, when the world stood at the edge of a nuclear disaster, America stepped forward. When time ran out, America showed courage. And when the moment came to confront the forces of extinction, America led. Now it is time for the rest of the world to guarantee that the threat of a nuclear Iran never returns. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Israel for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Kuwait.
شكرا سيدة الرئيسة.
Thank you, Madam President. Allow me at the outset to wish you and your friendly country to thank you for quickly calling for this meeting, and to thank the Secretary General for being here and for his righteous words at the start of this session. I also thank Mr. Miroslav Jenscha and Mr. Grossi for their valuable briefings. Ladies and gentlemen, members of the Security Council, on behalf of GCC countries, that include the State of United Arab Emirates, the Kingdom of Bahrain, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the State of Qatar, the Sultanate of Oman, and my country, Kuwait, we reiterate that the GCC group follows with grave concern the accelerating developments in the region, particularly the most recent developments that included the targeting of nuclear facilities inside Iran, in a dangerous development that threatens regional and international peace and stability. GCC countries warn against the repercussions of the continuation of this escalation that could lead to further tensions and exacerbate risks that face the security of the region and its peoples. We call for an immediate cessation of military actions and exercise of maximum restraint, avoiding anything that could lead to a spillover of this conflict, while reiterating that dialogue and diplomatic means are the best means to address conflicts and reach peaceful solutions. In this context, GCC countries reiterate the importance for this Council and the international community to shoulder their responsibilities fully towards stopping these violations and to genuinely work on ensuring the respect of the sovereignty of states and the safety of their critical facilities, including nuclear facilities that are under the IAEA safeguards regime. GCC countries express their deep conviction that there needs to give priority to diplomacy and dialogue to settle conflicts and disagreements within comprehensive approaches that achieve stability, prosperity, and justice. And we reiterate the importance of doubling efforts that aim at finding political solutions to put an end to this crisis and open a new page of security and stability in the region. In conclusion, Madam President, GCC countries are firmly committed to support all regional and international efforts aiming at diffusing this crisis and consolidating security and stability and to preserve the interests of peoples in the region and the world. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Kuwait for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Iraq.
I thank you, Madam President. I thank you for and value your efforts in convening this emergency session. We thank His Excellency the Secretary General for participating in this meeting and acknowledging the gravity and the repercussions of the current situation and his calls for de-escalation. We thank the Assistant Secretary General as well as the Director General of the IAEA. Madam President, the Security Council meets today in an emergency session, and it bears upon its shoulders the task of maintaining international peace and security at a time when our region is witnessing a dangerous escalation that threatens to destabilize the world and the region. Iraq speaks in a moderate voice and expresses its extreme concern over the accelerating and dangerous developments that the region is witnessing, at the forefront of which is the ongoing military escalation and the ensuing military attack against 3 nuclear reactors in Iran. And we believe in Iraq that this attack is a dangerous escalation and a direct threat to regional and international peace and security. It risks increasing the chances of conflict and the chances of the war expanding as other regional international parties join the fray with no authorization by the Security Council. This raises serious questions on the respect for the global order that is based on international legitimacy. Madam President, the developments that the region and the current conflict have witnessed is a true test of the rules-based international system that is based on international law and the UN Charter. Unilateral actions that bypass the Security Council weaken the prestige of the international organization and keep the door open to military chaos with unpredictable consequences. Moreover, targeting nuclear facilities, regardless of the disagreements over such facilities, is a dangerous precedent that runs counter to diplomatic efforts that aim to resolve the nuclear file through dialogue and international controls, especially the role of the IAEA in this matter. Iraq confirms that targeting declared nuclear facilities is a dangerous precedent in the non-proliferation regime and the comprehensive safeguards regime, as indicated in the Resolution 487 as well as the IAEA Board of Governance. It also runs counter with Article 4 of the NPT Treaty, which guarantees all member states the right to develop and use nuclear energy for peaceful purposes within a framework of transparency and international oversight. targeting nuclear facilities could lead to catastrophic radiation leakage that would go beyond the borders of the targeted state and would pose a direct threat to the lives of nearby human beings and the environment, including Iraq. We note the dangerous nature of cross-border radiation leakage and how it affects the countries and peoples of the region. This is a serious danger, and we warn of the dire environmental and human consequences of this. We regret to note that this military development has narrowed the timeline and diplomatic horizon for a potential peaceful resolution. Moreover, it did not give negotiations and political attempts to resolve tensions a chance. It also prevented the IAEA from performing its technical role in accordance with its mandate as stipulated by its statute, which is to verify the nature of nuclear activity. Madam President, our region and over the past decades has witnessed repeated situations of tension and instability. Our peoples have suffered from war and conflict that have brought death upon the people and destruction upon the infrastructure and have obstructed development offers. We find ourselves today before a dangerous crossroads that threatens to ignite a comprehensive and all-out regional war, with the ensuing violation of the sovereignty of states through repeated violations of their airspace and territories as neighboring states, with the catastrophic economic impacts of that, as global supply chains are experiencing severe disruptions and the economies of the region are facing major challenges, and as threats continue to endanger maritime passages, which are the lifeline of international trade and the economy of states. Iraq, and based on its geographic location and regional role, is directly impacted by these developments. We have recorded repeated violations of our airspace by the conflicting parties. We consider this a violation of the sovereignty of Iraq and a violation of international law and the United Nations Charter. We renew our firm belief, our firm rejection that Iraq absolutely rejects the use of its territories or airspace to carry out military operations that harm the safety and security of any state in the region, regardless of the party involved or the purposes invoked. In closing, Madam President, Iraq stresses the need to reinstate trust in joint international action. The Security Council must once again be the main forum where crises are handled. We stress the importance of respecting the sovereignty of states whose territories and airspace must not be used in any military confrontation without their consent. Iraq calls for bolstering diplomatic solutions and for activating negotiations and for learning from the lessons of past crises in the region. Iraq calls for the protection of civilians from any military action that affects them directly or indirectly. The peoples of our region are looking to this Council and expecting it to shoulder its historic and legal responsibilities at this crucial juncture, so that wisdom and dialogue would prevail, so that we must work together to lay down the foundations of stability and peace in the region, foundations of justice and the respect for international law and international humanitarian law. We call on all parties to avoid further escalation and to return to serious and responsible dialogue in order to maintain the stability of the region and the world. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Iraq for his statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.
Yes.